Thank you, Elliot, for this very impressive review of the Plantagenet monsters and
we're all Yorkists.
yes. Well, we have a lot to say, and as ever, Richard III is a fascinating character indeed, whether true or false. Now that his bones have been taken out of the earth, what do we know about him that perhaps Moore was right about or wrong about? But there's so much to say that I'm not speaking, and you are, so please, your questions. So, Jerry.
Yeah, I'd like to start, Guillaume's come back. Actually, this brings us back to Marie Claire's category of the 20th century interest in the life of the inner man of Thomas More, because early on you were saying that this bilingual poetics was part, one of your conjectures was partly had to do with self-formation. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about the kind of self that you see more forming by this poetic practice of his, and what for? What was he preparing this self for? Public life that preserved contemplative life, etc.
Well, I mentioned this criterion, like the internal motivations for symbolism, and I said it already seems applicable to Richard III, in my opinion. But your question is interesting if we think about devotional works. Why were some of the devotional works written in Latin and some in English? That's a question I have not addressed because the topic here is Thomas More history. But then I think the closest way to answer your question, if we wanted to answer your question, we would have to answer this question, to have a close look at the devotional works, which were not destined to publication, so they were written for himself, so they said something about himself, his own relation to himself, and why some in English, why some in Latin. I haven't thought about this, but I mean, it's related to
Elizabeth? Well, I was fascinated by the way that you showed how Sallust, in a sense, is absorbed into the English. And with your classical background, I think you gave us a reading that anyone with some classical, more than I have, certainly would see this extra dimension. The only question I would have is that it seems to me at the same time Moore changes the structure, and that the structure of the English is classical in that with that Sallust. But the structure of the English and Latin are so different with the form, the structure, because the one is abbreviated and the other goes much longer. And I just wondered if you'd want to say something about that in reference to the classical and chronicle forms.
I think it's a vexed question. So the vexed question is, why does Latin stops at the end of the usurpation, making some kind of round closed history, like first part of Richard III, and why is there an English continuation, and why is this continuation unfinished? Because it isn't finished, and we can never answer this question because it's questioning the intentionality of Moore's design. But then the state in which these texts have been transmitted to us and the level of information we have about them forbid us to have any certainty. We can only make conjectures. So For us, the Latin looks complete, close, you know, like, okay, this is the end of the first part, and maybe he never started the second part. But who knows that he didn't have a, you know, a draft book and started to work on the second part and we lost that draft book. We don't know, really. I think this is contingent, you know, this is the contingencies of the transmissions of the text forbid us to have to say anything certain about this. It's only conjectures. It's an interesting point. It might be an optical illusion.
Isn't that also tied in with that he didn't publish either one? And why not? I mean, that's a fascinating question.
Exactly. Another fascinating question to which we can have absolutely no answer.
It's usually said that another Buckingham was executed in 1521, and that's true. And that Moore saw Henry getting more and more tyrannical and thought it better not to finish and just publish.
Yes.
That's one answer. But
it's a conjecture. We don't even know when he wrote this text. You know, some people said he wrote it in between 1510 and 1520, and some others suggest that he might have reworked the Richard III as late as 1530 or after his resignation. We don't even know that. So.
Yes.
Well, I mean, to some extent, this question of Moore's ideological stance is also intricately tied up with his stance towards Henry VII. So I was wondering, I see two aspects in the Richard III that neither of you have mentioned. One would be, I think there was a kind of generational struggle between the humanists that were active at the court of Henry VII, who were mainly of Italian or French descent, like Bernard André or Pietro Camilliano, also Polygon Virgil, and the new generation, the Erasmus humanists that were then active under Henry VIII, and some of this can be perceived in Moore's epigrams. For example, when he makes fun of André or Camilliano, he makes fun of Bernard André's epigrams. Epigram collection. He had written a commendatory poem for that collection. I think David Carlson talks about this in his study of printed books on Henry VII. He had written a commendatory poem for André's collection, and then he publishes the same poem in his epigrams under the title On a Stupid Poet, and it becomes entirely satirical. And he also makes fun of another commendatory poem by Camilliano. And the interesting fact is that André had also published a Historia of Henry, Historia Vita Henrici VII, so a history of Henry VII, which was much more, even more providentialist than Rouse and the other sources. And it makes much of Henry VI's prophecy that Richmond should be king. It has poems and commentary hymns. And to some extent, I would see certain anecdotes that Moore includes in his history. For example, after there is this moment when Buckingham and Richard present themselves in old armor and pretend that there has been an uprising, and they have to prepare in order to justify the murder of Hastings, or the execution of Hastings. And Moore has this anecdote about, I think, a teacher, some citizen of London, commenting, because there is this proclamation rapidly patched up, and he said it has probably, because it was clear from the proclamation that it must have been composed before, because it was so elaborate. So the citizen ironically comments, this must have been done by prophecy. So I think one aspect is that Moore perhaps tries to ridicule this previous approach, and he also takes up some of the patterns of Virgil, of Polio Virgil, who's much more differentiated and critical. But the other aspect that I see is that Moore's dance itself is heavily ironical. So he's not just trying to devise an ultra-providentialist pattern, but by always imitating or by including the Sebastian and Tacitan echoes and having the ironical stance of Tacitus. People have said, I have heard, this should be true. I mean, there's hardly ever, just a factual statement there. I think Moore's text becomes just much more complex and much more ironical than simply a support of the Tudor cause. And maybe that is also one of the reasons that he thought it perhaps too risky to publish it as long as.
Okay, Elizabeth.
Well, tyranny is a really dangerous subject, especially at that time. And Moore had already gotten into trouble, in a sense, by opposing Henry VII early on. And then he wrote that very elaborate praise of the young Henry VIII with the special illuminated manuscript and everything. But pretty clearly, by the time he's writing, it seems to be, Richard III and Utopia, he is well aware of the way that kings manipulate power. It seems to me it probably would have been too dangerous for him to publish.
Oh, yes.
I mean, the irony that always scares me is when Richard III goes to Westminster Hall, and I think he sits, or at least he's near the throne of justice, and he holds the sword and promises to obey all the laws of England. And here is a man who's already violated practically every law you could think of, and has no intention of enforcing the laws of England. So, I mean, this irony, this heavy irony is almost scary. And Moore separates that from the anointment part of the coronation, which highlights this legal issue more than it would normally be in a coronation. So it's really, to me, it's really frightening. And Moore was a lawyer, so, it kind of hits home.
Elliot, you wanted to answer that?
Well, yeah, no, I think there are a couple of things. Moore makes a point often in his religious works that he's not really defending the Pope, he's defending the papacy, he's defending the office. And in this case, one could argue that Moore is defending the monarchy. The players of the monarchy are the Plantagenets. They're the ones that are the target for derision. He can't get excited about some of the Borgia popes either, but the Plantagenets were targets of this derision. And I think you're quite right. He did know Henry the Seventh. He's writing this certainly after Henry died, so as far as the Tudor reign is concerned, it isn't really Henry anymore, it's the Tudors. And Henry VIII has, of course, got his own agendas. Moore sees a lot of things. He's very skeptical about joining the court to begin with, from the period of time that his name is put on the list of joining the court. And of course, Hathaway gives his response about joining the court, but that's a response that Moore would have known was similar to what Pico della Mirandola did. Pico also refused to serve the court because he wanted to have an independent life of a scholar. So he had wisdom, but he didn't want to necessarily impose it on other people. All of those attributes are part, I think, of the Tudor mystique that Moore is trying to preserve as a political statement, and it is a dangerous thing to say, as far as that's concerned, because it is getting involved in a very touchy issue. And while he would like to close the door on that touchy issue, what are their Plantagenets still left to become king? Well, that haunted Henry VIII's rule. It haunted, at the end of Henry VIII. Even Elizabeth was still haunted by people who were connected in one way or another in their genealogy to the Plantagenet dynasty. And even if the marriages had gone through many different cycles and people and whatnot, it was still complicated. It was all connected. This older dynasty of 300 years had carried weight, and it was negative weight when you take it as a political policy. So I think that those issues are good. The Latin and the English, though, is an intriguing question, because Moore is multilingual in that regard. He does write texts in English and in Latin. Who is his readers? Moore is a rhetorician. He's talking to people. And so he is going to adopt the long-winded English rather than the short Latin for the target audience. And that becomes an important issue, reader response. We talk about that as a modern, postmodernist theory to consider. But we should consider Moore's writing to people. He's talking to people. He wants them to understand. He wants them to believe things. He wants to give them certain power. So I'll quote the man on the street. And that'll make all men on the street, or women on the street too, to feel good about themselves. That they knew more than they knew the truth, rather than what actually happened. But truth is overrated, and fact is overrated, and often is not, as we've discovered, unfortunately, in our own culture. Belief systems are sometimes overwhelmed by, or overwhelming what is known to be true, because we have to believe.
Yes, you are.
It strikes me that about this issue of writing in English, I sort of favor early composition for Richard III, but nonetheless, he's writing for people who may have known Richard. He's writing in English for people who actually have their own versions of a history. It's not like if you write, and the whole question of history kind of bothers me too, because Pico and Richard III are contemporaries. One is a life of Pico, the other one is a history of Richard. It almost seems like we're creating, or Moore's creating kind of an object lesson when he writes both works. One is a private one, make private dynamic and make private choices, and Richard's choices were very public and had a very public impact, so I think that accounts for the different genre. But the English, he's writing for people who would have their own version of what he was telling them, or may have his own version, which may account for the greater rhetorical emphasis on, I heard this, you may have heard other things, the guy in the street says this, the person that you're sitting next to may have known some other bit of detail. So it's, in a sense, accommodating the synthesis of sources, but still presenting the same object lesson of Richard's duplicity and getting the rhetorical and the political point across that he wants to make, that tyranny doesn't change since Jugurtha. It's tyranny is tyranny, and this is what our English version, our garden variety version of what tyranny looks like in this island, but it's really the same story.
Can you mark it? You want to join in? Then afterwards.
Martin.
Go ahead. Ladies first.
About why he stopped writing it, or ended writing Richard, finish it. Quite a few of his works are unfinished. And could the simple answer be actually the obvious one? And that was just life and work. I mean, how often have you, or how often have I, or anybody else here, oh, I must finish that, I must do that, but we actually quite just don't get round to it, because something gets in the way. Life, work, time, he has a family, he was busy, he was entering the King's service, and it was, oh, must come back to that sometime, but he never actually got back to it.
That's absolutely possible.
I mean, just sometimes we think, well, why did he stop there? Perhaps it was this, perhaps it was that. Perhaps it was the simplest reason of all.
Yeah, too busy.
Too busy.
That's Father Mahado's I do. Always says he was too busy to
Yeah.
to continue to finish his last things, to finish his
It happens to
Richard
all of us
III.
at something or other.
I don't know.
Yeah, and it also says about Utopia, you know, that the completion was delayed. It was the first draft with the second book, and then like the completion of the first book was delayed because he was already too busy and he was not even chancellor. So
I think sometimes it's temptation to find it in that argument for something, and actually it's just, well, you never got back to it.
Yeah. Martin?
And maybe we can connect the writing of both in Latin and in English also to what I thought one of the most interesting points in your presentation, Guillaume, that you revealed a synthesis of classical and maybe more medieval, contemporary for Thomas More historiography in style and approach, and then if he can deliver a work of history in English and on the same subject, another version in Latin, that's maybe even enforcing, amplifying, reinforcing even this synthesis even further, because then Latin and English is one reference to the classical heritage and one to the more medieval culture. So,
You know, sorry, I am not particularly oriented towards the political, but there is a question that should at least be thrown out, I think, and that is the question to which More the man was interested in republicanism as distinguished from kingship and tyranny. And when people start thinking about this, they're thinking of the epigrams in which he is so anti the king or the tyrant. And I mean, this takes different forms. Sometimes it's that death levels us all, and so the king's pride is not well placed because he's going to end up dust just like the rest of us. And he can turn that into comic forms. And then there's that wonderful poem about which is better, a kingship or a republic. And it's a very ironic piece because he ends by saying, or the speaker ends by saying, well, do you have the power to make the change? And clearly he doesn't. And so the question is left hanging. And yet it seems as if he's more sympathetic to the republic issue than to the tyrant issue. I mean, if you look back in history, we certainly have more examples of bad kings than good ones. And his irony always is sort of puncturing the pride of the king, so that there's that the peasant who sees this king on his horseback and all that glory, and he says, "Is that the king? He's just a man in fancy clothes."
Yes.
And that comes up in a different way in Richard III. So there's that unease. I mean, which is why More's irony is so complicated.
Well, I think that the Plantagenet history, if you look at the list of who the kings are and what they did and what was involved with their reign, you do feel that there is a lot of tyranny to the role of kingship, and that when we think of the More's what I'll call Platonic sensibility or sympathy for republicanism, that's fine. But remember that Utopia is grounded on Utopus, and Utopus cannot be called a tyrant because he's good, he's moral, he's rational, but he is absolute. So you have the absolutism of the good king vis-a-vis the absolutism of the evil king. And that type of thing makes it difficult to make the assumption that he's much more of a Republican than he would be So I think, again, there is that sense of difference. Good is good, and if it's a republic, that's fine, but the monarch can be good also. Can also be a messiah.
Yes.
I think it's a very interesting point because this offers an answer to the question, it's a very important question you asked at the end of your paper, the relationship between Utopia and Richard, because they were obviously written at least the beginning of the first draft of the Richard at the same period. And of course the articulation between like Richard III, actual history of an actual kingdom, and Utopia, fictional history of fictional, I'm sorry, but I think republic and not kingdom. I think Utopia, I mean, of course Utopia's founder is an absolute monarch, but I mean, everything else in Utopia is republic. And even the king of Utopia is actually the leader of the republic. And if Monarch says in one of these letters, I picture myself as king of Utopia, it means that it's not a kingdom in the sense as the Plantagenet England was a kingdom, of course.
Speaker of Parliament.
So last question, Martin.
I think the political model, both Thomas More and Erasmus were defending, embodies also this thesis of classical and medieval elements. Classical elements like republicanism, like a Roman Senate, or people's sovereignty like in classical Athens, but also the medieval aspect of a prince. And you can combine that in a political system of what we are now calling parliamentary democracy, the system also of the utopian society, where people elect a parliament, and the parliament has the sovereignty to assign or depose the prince. So not only in approach and style and languages, but even in content, you have this synthesis of classical and medieval elements, Christian, Jewish elements, and that's very, very typical for the Christian humanists. In the end, they also called Europe the Christian Republic, Respublica Christiana.
Yeah, thank you very much.